about building trails, that's always a conversation too. It's, it's overuse and therefore it's destroying the trails. So now we know these trails probably weren't necessarily built with this, the kind of traffic in mind that we have here. So what's your opinion as far as how the trails are and how the trails could actually be, are they eroding? Is that an idea that it isn't exactly what people say it is? What's your opinion on the trails themselves with your experience building trails?
Right. The trails are degrading. They're in very bad condition. The Adirondack Trail System is the worst trail system in the United States. That
Oof,
that
big
that
words.
is no exaggeration. I've hiked all over the US. I've built trails in 6 different states. The Adirondack Trail system is the worst one
Got it.
in the US. They're in very poor condition, and they're just going to keep getting worse. Now, again, it's kind of like the giardiasis argument. I agree with people up to a certain point. So there are certain organizations, state, federal, local, and private, that say, hey, these trails are in really bad shape. And I go, yes, I agree. But then we go down, no pun intended, we go down different paths. And I am on a path paved with evidence. And they, on the other hand, are making assumptions. Okay, so why do these trails look so bad? Most people say it's due to overuse. And there's that word again, overuse. And you'll see this through many agencies based right out of the high peaks. They'll say, well, there are so many hikers on the trails that the trails are eroding. And then I say, that is not true. And it's not open to discussion. It is not true. You're wrong. Okay. This is how trails become degraded. There are 3 forces that degrade trails. The first one, and the first that causes the most damage by far out of 3, is erosion. So you have snow melt, it rains, and water goes rushing down the trail, and it's sweeping away clay, settlement, sediment, pebbles, and stuff like that. And it goes flying down the trail, and now you're left with a trench. Hikers cannot erode trails because hikers are not water. Water is the only force that coincides with erosion. The other force is displacement. And that's where soil is being flung off the trail. So a great example of displacement is an ATV. An ATV is driving down a trail. It's got 4 enormous knobby tires, these big treads, and they bite into the soil and they fling it off the trail. But hikers are not ATVs. The last force, it's the minimal of the 3, is compaction. And a great example of a high compaction force is a horse. So a horse weighs half a ton, but it has these tiny hooves, and they hammer down the trail and compact it. But people are not horses. So we have erosion, displacement, and compaction. These 3 forces cannot be made to any serious effect by hikers. It's really the design of the trail. So if you design a trail correctly, you can have an infinite amount of hikers. You can even have ATVs on it. You can have horses on it, whatever. It all comes down to design. And you're absolutely right. When these trails were built in the 1800s, even into the early 1900s, they had no clue that they would erode, they would have this use, they would become quagmires. They just didn't really anticipate it. But again, the how to solve this is to stop building trails that do not follow the rules of sustainable design. And I know some of the people who design trails in the Adirondacks, they are not students of sustainable design. It might be a forester, and a forester does not know much or perhaps nothing about sustainable trail design. It's very interesting. I'm now based in Colorado Springs. I have a good friend here. He has his own private trail building company, Terra Firma Trails. He recently went to a land manager conference. There were 200 different land management well, I should say there were at least 200 different land managers there. They had been working for state, federal, and private agencies between the group for decades and decades and decades. He was the first trail builder they had ever spoken to.
Wow. That's sad.
And look, they were great folks. They were like, we've got all these trail problems. We don't know what to do. What makes a bad trail? What makes a good trail? Should we hire you? Should it be machine built? Should it be hand built? Does it need hardening? They're asking all these questions. And of course, he's rattling off these great answers. And they just had this look like we had no idea this was an actual field and an actual science.
Mm-hmm.
And it is. There are trail builders, and then there are trail designers schooled in sustainable design. Big difference.
Totally. So now in your mind, what would be, let's say, what would be the solution if money was no object, which we know money is an incredible object, especially here in New York State? What would be your way to solve the problem if money was no object, and then in a more realistic manner? Not just a Band-Aid, but like moving forward here in the Adirondacks as far as the trails go. What would you say would be the way to better the trails? Let's just put it that way.
Right. Well, I guess there would be three components. One, no new trails. Okay, so if you've got a mountain somewhere and doesn't have any trails and you want to build a trail up it, no. We've got enough trails and we've got enough problems already.
I agree completely.
Moratorium on new trails. Boom, done. Okay. The second would be education. So I actually don't know. I would like to know how many trail builders in the Northeast are familiar with sustainable design. When I built trails in New England for the U.S. Forest Service in the early 2000s, I know what the number was. It was 0. No one I ever built trails with in the early 2000s in the Northeast knew anything about sustainable design. They had never even heard of it. So it'd be interesting, if you quizzed 100 Northeast trail builders, Adirondack Mountain Club, Appalachian Mountain Club, Maine Appalachian Trail Club, New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, on and on and on these groups go. How many are familiar with sustainable design? We do have some. I know some, but I think they're in the minority. So the next step would be to take all these trail builders and send them to some type of sustainable design training. Maybe a 4-day training, maybe a 6-day training with somebody like me, somebody like my friend Steve, who I just mentioned. There are some other really good, actually sustainable design trail builders in the Northeast I know of. Have these employees go to that. And then the third step, they have to just get out in the field and show us what they know. All right. So no more water bars, no more rock steps. This is ridiculous stuff. They don't work. They don't work. It needs to be just straight up sustainable design. So no new trails, educate the trail builders. And then what trails are they going to tackle in the end? Probably the ones that just get the most traffic. So you can start with Cascade, you can go to Hurricane Mountain, you can go up Porter, you can go up in the McIntyre Mountains, stuff like that. It's going to be a long, slow process. I forget the numbers, but I recently read somewhere how many feet of trail the DEC thinks a trail builder can build, let's say, in a day. And I forget the number, but I know it was about 30 times what I would say. So that means they're just banging out trail, and it's a very low quality trail. So what they need to do, they need to slow down and take it foot by foot by foot. Trail building is very slow, tedious business. Some days you're going to feel like you got nothing done, but it pays for itself in the long run.
Sure. So you're saying some of the less traveled trails at this point, they kind of are just going to be, they are what they are. And then your thought would be focus on the more traveled trails to start, at least.
Yeah, because you're going to improve the user experience for the most amount of people the quickest.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. All right, so I'm going to wrap things up here with a couple final questions that I like to ask everyone that I'm speaking with.
Hmm.
First, what do you keep in your backpack at all times? What are must-have items in your backpack when you're out there?
I have whether even on a day hike, I'll bring enough gear to spend the night. That's always in my pack. So, for example, out here in the West, I'll have a winter hat, down vest, bivy sack, and a tarp. So I always bring enough stuff to spend the night. When I'm climbing mountains, I also bring a journal and 2 cameras.
2 cameras.
Yeah, just for fun. One is particularly good at catching the sky and clouds. The other has a great zoom if I want to take photos of birds.
Sure. All right, cool. Now, in your mind, what makes the Adirondacks a special place? You've obviously been all over the country exploring the outdoors. So, what would you say makes this place unique?
The Adirondacks are legitimate wilderness. It's very wild land. Not a lot of people associate the term New York with wilderness. It's definitely one of the wildest places I've ever been. So, for example, I climbed every peak above 2,500 feet in the Adirondacks. There are 601, and I think about 90 have trails.
Sure.
So that is some real wilderness if you climb 600 peaks and 500 don't have trails to their tops. Quite impressive wilderness.
Yeah, absolutely. So now why do you hike? Hiking obviously, especially for you, you're always out there. You're mostly bushwhacking. It's obviously tough work on the body, on the brain. What is the reason that you constantly are out there?
Well, I'm a thinker. And when I'm out in the wilderness by myself and taking compass bearings and looking at my map, or if it's a long distance hike, where am I going to camp? Where am I going to get food? Do I have all the gear? I like the methodical planning leading up to the hike. And then I like being out there and really using my brain. That's one of the reasons I've actually never used a GPS. I like the old school map and compass because it makes me think more.
Perfect. That makes perfect sense. So now what's next for you? So you moved out to Colorado recently. What's next for
Hmm.
you?
Well, boy, I mean, I'm starting at scratch out here, and that's one of the main draws of being here. It's now my second hiking life. It's very refreshing to climb a mountain I had never been up before, and I look out on the horizon. I mean, maybe I can pick out one or two peaks by name, but it's totally new.
Sure.
And then I'll look down the ground and I'll see a track, and I'm like, I don't need, is that a bighorn sheep or a moose or an elk? I don't even know what this track is. And I'm standing in some kind of pine grove, and I'm like, is this lodgepole pine or sugar pine? So what I love about being out here is everything's new: the birds, the mammals, the weather, the geology, the mountains. But not to sound too cliche, my heart will always be in the Adirondacks. So I'm working on my next Adirondack book, which is about settler history. So I'm looking at every little corner of the Adirondacks, and it's going to be a massive 2-volume book. And it basically answers the question, who got where first?
Cool. Super cool. That sounds fascinating. I'm a big fan of history in general. So to
Yeah.
me, that sounds really interesting. So where can people find you online? I know they can find you at transadk.com. Where else can they find you? Where can they pick up your books?
Yep. So we've got the TransADK route website. And then the main publishing website is my own publishing company I started a few years ago, Beechwood Books. And that's just BeechwoodBKS.com, beechwoodbooks.com. And then I have one just wasn't good enough. So I have 2 Instagram pages. My personal one is just US_mountains. You can see all my journeys in Colorado, Adirondacks, etc. And then the TransADK route has its own little Instagram page. Very simple address. It's just TransADK. We've got all kinds of pretty photos and information there.
All right, very cool. Well, I'm going to have to bring Erik back for another episode sometime because the man's experience could be talked about for hours. But I think we'll wrap it up right here tonight. Thanks to Erik Schlimmer for coming on the show to talk all about his outdoors experience here in the